The message came through every communication channel in the galaxy at exactly the same moment. Ambassador Helen Morris stood in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council, with her hands clasped behind her back and her face showing no emotion at all. She had practiced this moment for weeks in front of mirrors and screens, making sure every word would come out clear and strong. Around her sat the representatives of 400 different alien species, some in chairs designed for bodies like hers, others floating in anti-gravity fields, or resting in pools of liquid methane. The chamber was enormous, big enough to hold a small city, with walls that shifted colors based on the mood of the crowd. Right now those walls were flickering between confused orange and angry red. Helen took one step forward and began to speak. The United Earth government was withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective immediately. All treaties were void, all agreements were cancelled, all obligations were finished. Humanity would no longer participate in council affairs, follow council laws, or recognize council authority. The human colonies scattered across 50 star systems would remove all council infrastructure within 30 days. Human ships would leave council space within 60 days. Human personnel would return home within 90 days. There would be no negotiations, no discussions, and no compromise. Earth was done. The reaction was instant chaos. The Velcrin ambassador, a creature that looked like living crystal with too many angles to count, let out a sound like breaking glass. The Torgath delegation started arguing among themselves in their clicking language that always sounded like angry insects. The Zafrani representative, who breathed chlorine and sat in a sealed tank, began flashing colors so fast it hurt to look at. But Helen noticed the Axiom Collective representatives staying perfectly still. These gray-skinned telepaths with their huge black eyes and thin bodies just stared at her without moving. They understood something the others did not. This was real. Back on Earth in the city of Washington, President Daniel Hayes sat at his desk in the Oval Office. The cameras were ready and the speech was loaded on the teleprompter in front of him. He straightened his tie one last time and nodded to the director. The red light came on and he began to speak to the entire planet at once. For 200 years, humanity had been part of the Galactic Council. For 200 years, they had followed the rules, paid the fees, and accepted the restrictions placed on them. They had been told where they could colonize and where they could not. They had been told what technologies they could research and what technologies were forbidden. They had been told to be grateful for the privilege of membership even as other species profited from human inventions and human labor. President Hayes leaned forward and his voice grew harder. The Council treated humanity like children who needed constant supervision. They dismissed human ideas as too aggressive or too dangerous. They blocked human expansion into promising star systems while giving those same systems to other species. They took human discoveries and claimed them as Council property. They demanded human soldiers fight in their wars, but refused to give humans equal voting rights. They asked for human aid during every crisis, but mocked human culture as primitive and violent. Enough was enough. Today, humanity would stand alone and stand proud. Within hours, the orders went out to every human colony, every human station, and every human ship. Commander Lisa Bennett received her orders while leading a peacekeeping fleet near the outer reach. She read the message 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. Her fleet of 30 ships was to cease all operations, refuse all communications from Council forces, and return to Earth immediately. She looked at the message for a long moment before forwarding it to her captains. Her communications officer reported that the Council station nearby was sending frantic messages, asking what was happening. Lisa told him to ignore them all. They were going home. The human colonies went to work immediately. On the mining world of Kepler-7, Colony Director Greg Palmer stood on the landing pad and watched as the Council tax collector ship prepared to land. The ship had come every month for 15 years to collect the fees that Earth paid for the privilege of mining there. Greg raised his hand and spoke into his communicator. The defense grid powered up and locked weapons on the approaching ship. The Council ship stopped moving immediately. Greg sent them a simple message: leave now or be destroyed. The ship turned around and jumped away. The mining fees would never be paid again. On the research station orbiting the star called Phoenix, scientist Brandon Cole shut down the quantum laboratory he had spent 5 years building. The research he was doing would have cured a plague affecting dozens of alien species. His alien colleagues stood in the doorway begging him to stay and finish the work. Brandon felt terrible, but his orders were clear. He downloaded all the research to encrypted drives that only humans could access. He wiped the station computers. He sealed the laboratory. The cure would have to wait until the aliens learned to respect humanity. Until then, they could solve their own problems. Commander Nina Foster led her destroyer squadron away from the neutral zone between two hostile alien empires. For 10 years, her ships had patrolled this space and prevented war. The Council Station commander sent her desperate messages. If she left, war would break out within days. Nina sent back a short reply. That was no longer humanity's concern. Her ships engaged their jump drives and vanished into the space between dimensions. Behind them, the two empires began moving warships toward their shared border. The war that started 3 days later killed millions. On Earth, the reaction was different than anyone expected. The news networks showed protests in some cities, but celebrations in others. People were tired of being told they were not good enough for the galaxy. They were tired of restrictions and condescension. They were tired of giving everything and receiving nothing in return. In New York, crowds gathered in Times Square and cheered as the president's speech played on every screen. In London, people danced in the streets when the first human ships returned from council space. In Tokyo, Beijing, and Mumbai, citizens celebrated what they called Independence Day. The Galactic Council held emergency meetings for 3 days straight. Chancellor Vrex of the Calthorian Empire called for sanctions against Earth. Others suggested military action to force humanity back into compliance. But the Axiom Collective representative finally spoke in their quiet mental voice that everyone could hear in their heads. Earth controlled too much of the galaxy's infrastructure. Attacking them would be suicide. The better question was how to survive without them. That was when the first reports started coming in, and the Council realized just how much trouble they were in. The emergency session of the Galactic Council started badly and got worse. Chancellor Vrex stood at the center of the chamber with all 4 of his arms raised, trying to restore order. But nobody was listening. The representatives were shouting at each other in dozens of languages, while the translation system struggled to keep up. Some were demanding immediate action against Earth, while others were panicking about the reports flooding in from across the galaxy. Vrex finally slammed his lower arms on his podium hard enough to crack the stone. The boom echoed through the chamber and everyone went silent. Vrex spoke in his deep, rumbling voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. Earth was one species among hundreds. Their departure was unfortunate but not catastrophic. The Council had existed for thousands of years before humans arrived, and would continue for thousands of years after they left. They would adapt and overcome. Other species would fill the gaps left by human withdrawal. Everything would be fine. The words sounded confident, but Vrex did not look confident at all. A human woman stood up in the observer section. Her name was Celine Worth, and she had worked as a trade minister for the Council for 20 years. Unlike the other humans, she had not returned to Earth. She wanted to watch what happened next. She walked down to the main floor without being invited, and brought up a holographic display that filled half the chamber. Vrex started to object, but Celine ignored him completely. The display showed trade routes across the galaxy. Celine highlighted the ones turning red. These were the routes that had been operated by human cargo companies. They represented 40% of all shipping in Council space. As of this morning, all of them had shut down. Human ships were returning to Earth. Human warehouses were being emptied. Human ports were closing. She moved to the next display. This showed medical facilities. The red ones were human-operated hospitals and clinics that served 17 colony worlds. All of them were closing. She moved to the next display showing communication networks. Most of them were maintained by human technicians who were leaving. She moved through display after display showing power plants and water treatment facilities, and terraforming stations and research laboratories. All of them depended on humans in some way, and all of them were failing. The chamber was completely silent now. Celine turned to face them all. The Council had spent 2 centuries treating humans as useful servants who should be grateful for the opportunity to help their betters. They had never realized that humans were not just participating in galactic civilization, but holding it together. The technology everyone used was based on human designs. The trade networks everyone relied on were built by human engineers. The peace everyone enjoyed was enforced by human soldiers. Take away the humans and the whole structure collapsed. A Velcrin representative stood up and asked the obvious question. They had their own engineers and scientists. Why could they not simply take over the systems the humans had built? Selena laughed, but it was not a happy sound. She explained that every species in the galaxy had been reverse engineering human technology for decades. They had taken human designs and made small modifications, then claimed them as their own innovations. They had grown dependent on human instruction manuals, human maintenance schedules, and human technical support. Without the humans, they did not actually know how anything worked. On the industrial world of Tertius, factory supervisor Greg Palmer stood in the control room of the largest manufacturing complex in the sector. The facility produced starship components, medical equipment, and electronics for half the nearby systems. It employed 50,000 alien workers who operated machines designed by humans, following processes invented by humans using materials refined by human methods. Greg had spent 15 years at this facility, working his way up from junior technician to supervisor. He knew every machine, every process, and every shortcut. The alien workers knew how to push buttons when the green light came on. That was all. The Tertian government had offered Greg triple his salary to stay. They had offered him citizenship, land, and a position in their government. Greg had refused everything. His orders from Earth were clear, and besides, he was insulted by the desperation. For 15 years, the Tertians had treated him as a useful technician who should be grateful to work in their facility. Now suddenly they realized the facility was worthless without him. Too late. Greg shut down the main power grid and locked all the control systems behind encryption that would take the Tertians years to break. The workers would figure it out eventually, but by then the factory would be obsolete. The same scene played out across the galaxy. On the agricultural colony of Harvest, human farmers shut down the automated systems that produced food for 8 billion people. The colonists had the equipment but not the knowledge to operate it. On the defense station called Guardian Point, human weapons technicians disabled the combat systems that protected 3 star systems from pirates. The local military had the weapons but not the training to use them. On the research vessel called Discovery, human scientists encrypted their data and destroyed their samples before leaving. The alien researchers had the laboratories but not the expertise to continue the work. The financial systems collapsed first. The Velcrin Confederacy had built their entire economy on quantum computing networks, designed and maintained by humans. Kyle Morris had supervised the installation of those networks 20 years ago. He had trained the Velcrin staff and provided ongoing technical support from his office on Mars. When Earth withdrew, Kyle shut down the remote access systems and recalled all the human technicians. The Velcrin networks lasted 3 days before critical errors started appearing. Within a week, the networks crashed completely. The Velcrin stock market, the Velcrin banking system, and the Velcrin currency all failed at once. Trillions of credits vanished. Billions of people lost their savings. The economy of one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy simply stopped working. The Axiom Collective faced a different crisis. Their civilization was based on telepathic communication that connected every member of their species in a mental network. They could share thoughts, emotions, and memories instantly across vast distances. It was beautiful and it was failing. The telepathic network depended on psionic amplifiers that boosted the natural mental abilities of the Axiom. Those amplifiers had been designed by human psychic researchers and maintained by human technicians. Without maintenance, the amplifiers were degrading. The mental network was growing weaker. Axiom, who had spent their entire lives connected to billions of other minds, were suddenly experiencing isolation for the first time. The psychological damage was immediate and severe. Delegations from dozens of species arrived at the edge of human space. They came in fancy diplomatic ships with gifts and messages begging for negotiations. They were all turned away by General Victor Hayes, who commanded the Sol Defense Fleet. His orders were simple. No council ships were allowed in human space. No council representatives would be received. Earth had nothing to say to the council. Go away. The delegations tried arguing, pleading, and threatening. Nothing worked. The defense fleet kept weapons locked on any ship that did not leave immediately. Eventually, they all left. The peacekeeping forces withdrew and old conflicts exploded. The Calthorian Empire and the Draxian sovereignty had been enemies for 3,000 years. They had fought wars that killed billions before the council imposed peace. Human fleets had patrolled the border between them for a century, keeping both sides in check. When those fleets left, the surveillance networks went offline. Neither side could see what the other was doing. Fear and suspicion took over. Both empires began moving warships toward the border. Incidents occurred. Ships were destroyed. Colonies were attacked. Within a month, they were at full war again. Captain Nina Foster watched the reports from her ship as it traveled back to Earth. She felt no guilt about leaving. The Council had 200 years to build their own peacekeeping forces, but instead they had relied on human soldiers to do the dangerous work. That was their choice and their mistake. Besides, she remembered how the Council had treated human casualties. When her sister died defending a Council colony, the Council sent a form letter of appreciation. When a Velcrin soldier died in the same battle, the Council held a ceremony and built a monument. Humans were expected to die quietly and be grateful for the opportunity. President Hayes convened his Security Council in a secure facility deep underground. Intelligence Director Amy Clark presented her reports. The Council was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Wars were breaking out. Economies were failing. Entire species were abandoning their colonies and returning to their home worlds. Some planets were experiencing food shortages. Others were losing power. The infrastructure that supported modern galactic civilization was falling apart. Hayes listened to the reports and nodded. Good. Let them remember this. Let every species understand what happens when they take humanity for granted. Let them learn respect the hard way. 2 months after Earth withdrew from the Galactic Council, the galaxy looked like a completely different place. The Council still existed on paper, but it meant nothing anymore. Of the 400 species that had been members, less than 100 remained. The rest had withdrawn to focus on their own survival. The Grand Chamber, where representatives once debated policy, now sat mostly empty. The lights were dimmed to save power. The climate control systems only worked in certain sections. Nobody bothered to clean the floors anymore. It felt like a tomb for a dead civilization. Chancellor Vrek stood alone in that empty chamber, staring at the vacant seats. His empire was falling apart. The Calthorian economy had collapsed without access to human trade networks. Food shortages were causing riots in the cities. The military was stretched thin, trying to maintain order. Other Calthorian leaders were blaming Vrex for the disaster. They said he should have treated the humans better. They said he should have given humans more respect and more rights. They were probably correct, but it was too late now. Vrex had spent his entire career believing that the Calthorians were superior to younger species like humanity. He had been wrong, and his people were paying the price. The Velcrin Confederacy was in even worse shape. Their financial networks had never recovered from the initial crash. Banks were closed. Businesses were failing. Unemployment was at levels not seen in 1,000 years. The government had tried to rebuild the quantum computing systems, but quickly discovered they did not understand the underlying principles. Human engineers had built those systems using mathematics and physics that the Velcrin had never fully grasped. They had used the technology without understanding it. Now they were paying for that laziness. The Velcrin, who had once been one of the wealthiest civilizations in the galaxy, were now struggling to feed their population. The Axiom Collective was experiencing something worse than economic collapse. Their telepathic network had degraded to the point where many Axiom could barely sense each other anymore. A species that had lived in constant mental communion for millions of years was experiencing true isolation. The psychological impact was devastating. Axiom were having mental breakdowns. Suicide rates were climbing. Birth rates were dropping because parents could not bear the thought of bringing children into a disconnected world. The Axiom Council sent desperate messages to Earth begging for help. They offered anything. Technology, resources, territory, nothing worked. Earth refused to respond. On the trade hub called Nexus Prime, riots consumed the streets for the 3rd straight week. The station had been a center of commerce where 200 species came to buy and sell goods. It had been prosperous and peaceful. Now it was chaos. The human security forces that had maintained order were gone. The local police were overwhelmed. Criminal gangs were taking over entire sections of the station. Ships were afraid to dock there. Trade was dying. Station Administrator Patricia Reeves watched the news feeds from her apartment in New York. She had managed that station for 10 years and built it into something successful. Now she watched it burn and felt nothing but sadness and anger. Patricia had warned the council this would happen. 2 years ago, she had submitted a report explaining that removing human security personnel would destabilize the station. The council had dismissed her concerns. They said local forces could handle security. They said humans were exaggerating their own importance. They said Patricia was being dramatic. She had not been dramatic enough. The reality was worse than her worst predictions. Patricia wondered if the station would even exist in another month. The technology gap was creating disasters everywhere. Humanity had always been the galaxy's great innovators. Other species had reached the stars through slow, careful progress over millions of years. Humans had done it in barely 10,000 years. They had gone from primitive agriculture to interstellar civilization faster than any other known species. They had invented things that seemed impossible. They had solved problems that other species considered unsolvable. They had shared all of it freely through the Council's technology exchange programs. Now those programs were dead. Human patents were locked behind military-grade encryption. Human researchers had returned to Earth, taking their knowledge with them. Joint research projects were abandoned halfway through. The flow of innovation that had powered galactic progress for 2 centuries had stopped completely. The other species were on their own now, and most of them were not ready. Dr. Brandon Cole had been working on a cure for the Viridian plague for 5 years. The disease affected dozens of species, causing respiratory failure and death within months of infection. Millions were sick and thousands were dying every day. Brandon's research team had been close to a breakthrough. They had identified the genetic mechanism that made the plague so deadly. They had developed a treatment that showed promise in animal testing. Human trials were scheduled to begin in just a few weeks. Then the withdrawal order came. Brandon had tried to argue. He explained that people were dying and the cure was almost ready. His superiors had been sympathetic but firm. Orders from Earth were clear. All human personnel were to return home immediately. All research data was to be encrypted and secured. Nothing was to be left behind. Brandon had no choice. He shut down the laboratory. He encrypted the data. He destroyed the samples to prevent anyone from stealing them. His alien colleagues had begged him to stay. They had cried and pleaded. Brandon had felt terrible, but he left anyway. Now 6 months later, the plague was spreading faster than ever. Without the human research team, progress had stopped. The aliens were trying to continue the work, but they were years behind. They did not understand human genetic engineering techniques. They did not have access to human medical databases. They were essentially starting from scratch. Millions more would die before they figured it out, if they ever did. Brandon tried not to think about it, but sometimes late at night he wondered if he had made the right choice. The military situation was the most dangerous. The Galactic Council's defense fleet had been the largest military force in known space. It had maintained peace across thousands of star systems. It had protected weak species from strong ones. It had fought pirates and warlords and kept the trade lanes safe. The fleet had included ships from many species, but 70% of them were human-built, human-crewed, or human-maintained. When those ships returned to Earth, the Council lost most of its military power overnight. Admiral Frank Morris commanded the withdrawal operation. It was the largest military movement in galactic history. 8,000 human ships, from massive carriers that could destroy planets to small patrol craft that hunted pirates, all returned home. The operation took 2 months of careful coordination. Ships had to be removed from defensive positions without creating vulnerabilities. Personnel had to be evacuated from stations across the galaxy. Equipment and supplies had to be transported back to human space. It was complicated and difficult, but Frank's people did it perfectly. The Council tried to convince Frank to leave some ships behind. They offered him promotions and honors. They promised humanity greater influence in Council decisions. Frank had listened politely, then refused everything. The Council had spent 2 centuries restricting human military expansion. They had limited the size of human fleets and blocked humans from developing certain weapons. They had treated human soldiers as useful, but dangerous primitives who needed supervision. Frank remembered all of it, and so did his crews. They were going home, and the Council could defend itself for once. Without human fleets, the galaxy became extremely dangerous very quickly. Pirate organizations that had been suppressed for decades came out of hiding. They attacked trade ships and raided colonies with no fear of consequences. Warlords who had been confined to remote systems began expanding their territory. They conquered weak species and enslaved populations. Ancient enemies who had been kept apart by human peacekeepers went to war. Species that had nursed old grievances for centuries saw their chance for revenge. The careful peace that humanity had maintained was replaced by chaos and violence. The Draxian sovereignty attacked 3 Calthorian colonies in one day. They had been planning the assault for months, waiting for the right opportunity. When human surveillance networks went offline, the Draxians knew the time had come. They hit fast and hard. Orbital bombardment destroyed cities. Ground troops enslaved survivors. The Calthorian military tried to respond, but they were disorganized without human intelligence support. By the time they mobilized, the colonies were lost. Chancellor Vrex received the reports and knew his empire was finished. Without human help, the Calthorians could not defend themselves against their enemies. On Earth, President Hayes met with his military commanders in a secure bunker. They reviewed intelligence reports showing the galaxy descending into warfare. Hayes listened carefully to every briefing. His commanders asked if they should intervene to stop the worst conflicts. Hayes said no. The Council had 200 years to build a peaceful galaxy. Instead, they had relied on human soldiers to do all the dangerous work. Now they would learn what happened when those soldiers left. It was a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. 4 months after the withdrawal, Earth was thriving while the galaxy burned. The human economy was stronger than ever. Without council fees and restrictions, human businesses were booming. Trade within human space had doubled. New colonies were being established in systems the Council had declared off limits. Research programs that had been blocked for decades were making rapid progress. The restrictions were gone and humanity was free to grow at its natural pace again. President Hayes stood in his office looking at economic reports with satisfaction. Withdrawing had been the right choice. The rest of the galaxy was not doing so well. The galactic credit had lost 90% of its value. Most species had stopped accepting it completely. They were returning to direct barter or creating new regional currencies. The unified economy that had allowed seamless trade across thousands of light years was fragmenting into isolated markets. Species that depended on imports were suffering. Species that had specialized their economies were collapsing. The complex web of interdependence that had made the galaxy prosperous was unraveling fast. On the garden world of Verdantia, people were starving. The planet had been transformed into an agricultural paradise by human terraforming technology. The Verdantians had grown wealthy selling food to other systems. They had imported everything else they needed. When the trade networks collapsed, the food exports stopped. The Verdantians had credits, but nobody would accept them. They had technology, but nobody would trade for it. They had food, but it was rotting in warehouses because they could not ship it anywhere. Meanwhile, they had no fuel, no medicine, and no replacement parts for essential equipment. The Verdantian government sent desperate messages to Earth offering their entire agricultural output for just basic supplies. Earth did not respond. The collapse of healthcare was creating a humanitarian crisis. Human doctors and human medical facilities had provided care for billions across the galaxy. Human pharmaceutical companies had produced medicines that other species depended on. Human researchers had developed treatments for hundreds of diseases. All of that was gone now. Hospitals were running out of supplies. New epidemics were spreading without the medical infrastructure to contain them. People were dying from diseases that had been easily treatable just months ago. The suffering was immense and getting worse every day. Dr. Lucy Grant had run a hospital on the colony world of New Haven. The facility had served 6 different species, providing everything from routine care to advanced surgery. Lucy had managed a staff of 200 humans and 500 aliens. She had been proud of the work they did saving lives and advancing medical knowledge. When the withdrawal order came, Lucy and her human staff returned to Earth. They left behind a fully equipped hospital that the aliens could not operate. The alien staff knew how to follow procedures written by humans, but they did not understand the principles behind those procedures. They could not adapt to new situations or handle complications. Within weeks, the quality of care had deteriorated drastically. Lucy watched reports from New Haven showing overwhelmed emergency rooms and rising death rates. She had spent 15 years building that hospital into something special. Now she watched it fail because the aliens had never bothered to truly learn medicine. They had been content to be technicians following human instructions. That was not enough anymore. Lucy felt terrible about the people suffering, but she was also angry. The Council had restricted human medical research for decades, claiming humans were too aggressive in their approach to experimental treatments. Now those same species were begging for the experimental treatments that might save them. Too late. The technology situation was creating a different kind of crisis. Modern galactic civilization ran on technology that most species did not fully understand. They had grown up with quantum computers, fusion reactors, and faster-than-light travel. They used these things every day without thinking about how they worked. Most of that technology was based on human innovations from the last 2 centuries. Without human engineers to maintain it and human researchers to improve it, the technology was slowly failing. On the orbital station called Highport, Station Chief Victor Kane watched systems failing one by one. The fusion reactor that powered the station was operating at 70% efficiency and dropping. The quantum computer that managed life support was experiencing errors. The gravity generators were creating unstable fields. All of this equipment had been installed by humans and maintained by human technicians. The alien staff had manuals and training, but they did not have deep understanding. They could replace broken parts if they had the parts. They could follow repair procedures if the procedures covered the problem. Anything beyond that was beyond them. Victor sent daily reports back to Earth, documenting the slow collapse of Highport. The station would probably survive, but it would never operate properly again without human expertise. Eventually, it would be abandoned. The 50,000 people living there would have to relocate. Highport had been a center of trade and research. Soon it would be a dead hulk orbiting an empty planet. Victor found the whole situation darkly amusing. The station administration had spent years complaining that human technicians were too expensive and demanding. They had talked about training local staff to replace the humans. Now they had their wish and were discovering that some things cannot be learned from a manual. The security situation was completely out of control. Without human peacekeepers, vast regions of space had become lawless. Pirate fleets operated openly, attacking any ships they could catch. Some pirates were getting bold enough to assault major trade routes and planetary systems. Warlords were carving out empires in the chaos. Several dozen systems had fallen under warlord control already. The inhabitants were enslaved or killed. Resources were stripped and sold on black markets. The council tried to organize a response, but they no longer had the military power to do anything. The pirate lord called Crimson Jack had been a minor threat before the human withdrawal. His fleet of 30 ships had raided isolated freighters in the outer systems. Human patrol craft had hunted him for years, keeping him contained. When those patrols left, Jack saw his opportunity. He recruited aggressively, offering good pay and easy targets. His fleet grew to 200 ships. He attacked a council convoy carrying medical supplies and destroyed the escorts. He raided 3 colonies, taking everything of value. He declared himself ruler of the outer reach and dared anyone to stop him. Nobody did. Admiral Nina Foster read the reports about Crimson Jack from her office on Luna. She had spent 5 years hunting pirates like Jack and knew his tactics well. She could have dealt with him in a month with a small task force, but her orders were clear. Human forces would not operate outside human space. The Council wanted humanity gone from galactic affairs. They had gotten their wish. Nina sent the reports to intelligence and moved on to other matters. Let the Council deal with their own pirates. The wars were the worst part. Old conflicts that had been frozen by human intervention were exploding into violence. The Calthorian Empire and Draxian sovereignty were in total war now. Hundreds of ships destroyed. Dozens of planets bombarded. Billions of casualties. Both sides were using weapons they had been banned from developing under Council law. Chemical weapons. Biological weapons. Kinetic bombardment that created extinction-level impacts. Nobody was following any rules anymore. There were no human observers to document war crimes, no human peacekeepers to enforce ceasefires, no human diplomats to negotiate peace, just endless violence. The Zafrani Collective was fighting a civil war. Without the telepathic networks that unified their species, different factions had emerged with different ideologies. They were battling for control of their home system using weapons that threatened their own planet. The Zafrani Council sent messages to every species begging for help. They offered vast wealth to anyone who could restore their telepathic networks. Earth could have helped. Human psionic researchers understood the amplifier technology, but Earth refused all contact with former council members. The Zafrani would have to solve their own problems. Species were abandoning colonies across the galaxy. Without trade networks and defensive fleets, many colonies were not viable anymore. The colonists were evacuating back to their homeworlds, creating refugee crises. Billions of people were displaced. Ships were overcrowded. Resources were scarce. Disease was spreading. Some species were running out of room on their home planets and facing population disasters. The Council tried to coordinate refugee efforts, but they had no resources to help. They could barely feed their own personnel. On Earth, Intelligence Director Amy Clark briefed President Hayes on the latest developments. The galaxy was in complete chaos. Several species were at risk of extinction. Dozens of civilizations were collapsing. The death toll from wars, famines, and epidemics was in the billions. Hayes listened to everything, then asked a simple question. Had any species reached out with genuine apologies and requests for fair partnership? Clark checked her notes. 3 smaller species had sent messages acknowledging they had treated humanity poorly and asking for a chance to make amends. Hayes nodded. Those 3 species would be remembered. The others would not. Earth would help those who had. 6 months after Earth's withdrawal, President Hayes stood before the largest crowd ever assembled in human history. The new Global Unity Plaza in Geneva could hold 5 million people, and every space was filled. Above them, holographic displays showed another 50 million watching from locations around Earth and the colonies. This was the moment humanity had been building toward. Hayes wore a simple dark suit and no decorations. He did not need symbols of power. Everyone knew who he was and what he represented. Hayes began speaking in a calm, steady voice that carried across the plaza. 6 months ago, Earth had made the hardest decision in human history. They had walked away from the Galactic Council and turned their backs on the galaxy they had helped build. Many people had questioned whether humanity could survive alone. There had been protests and debates. Some had called the withdrawal foolish or cowardly, but the results spoke for themselves. Earth had not just survived, but thrived. The human economy was stronger than ever. Human technology was advancing rapidly without council restrictions. Human colonies were expanding into new systems. The population was united in purpose and pride. Humanity had proven they needed nobody but themselves. The crowd erupted in cheers that lasted several minutes. Hayes waited patiently for silence, then continued. However, humanity was not cruel or vindictive. The galaxy was in chaos, and humans took no joy in the suffering of others. Earth had learned important lessons over the past 6 months. The most important lesson was that partnership only worked when both sides gave respect. The Council had failed because it treated some species as masters and others as servants. Earth would not make that mistake. Therefore, Hayes was announcing the creation of the Terran Alliance, a new coalition based on 3 principles: mutual respect, fair trade, and genuine partnership. Hayes explained the terms carefully. Any species could apply to join the Terran Alliance. Members would receive access to human technology, human markets, and human military protection. But there would be costs. Members had to acknowledge past mistakes in how they treated humanity. Members had to open their borders to human trade and human colonization. Members had to accept that in the alliance, humans would have the final word on major decisions. This was not negotiable. Earth would help those who showed proper respect. Everyone else was on their own. The reaction across the galaxy was immediate. Within hours, 50 species had submitted applications to join the Terran Alliance. Within days, the number reached 200. Some applications were sincere expressions of regret and requests for partnership. Others were desperate pleas from civilizations on the edge of collapse. Earth reviewed every application carefully. A new department was created specifically to evaluate potential members. The head of that department was Lucy Grant, who had run the hospital on New Haven. She understood both the potential for cooperation and the dangers of accepting the wrong partners. Lucy sat in her office reviewing applications with her team. Each species had to submit detailed information about their government, economy, military, and history with humanity. Each application included a formal statement addressing how that species had treated humans during the Council era. Lucy and her team looked for genuine understanding versus empty words. They looked for species that had consistently shown respect versus species that had been dismissive or hostile. They looked for civilizations that could be trusted versus civilizations that would betray the alliance at the first opportunity. The Minari Confederacy was one of the first species accepted into the alliance. The Minari were a small civilization of only 20 billion people on 3 planets. They had always treated humans well during the Council era. When human merchants came to Minari space, they were welcomed and given fair prices. When human researchers asked to study Minari culture, they were given full access. When human soldiers fought to defend Minari colonies, the Minari built monuments honoring them. The Minari application included a thoughtful essay on their mistakes. They admitted that even though they had treated humans better than most species, they had still benefited from an unfair system. They wanted to do better. Lucy approved the Minari application immediately. Within a week, human ships arrived at Minari space bringing supplies, technology, and technicians. The Minari systems that had been struggling without council support were stabilized quickly. Human engineers repaired failing infrastructure. Human doctors treated Minari patients. Human teachers began training Minari students in advanced technology. The Minari were grateful, but more importantly, they were respectful. They did not demand help or expect gifts. They negotiated fair prices and honored their agreements. They were the model of what Alliance members should be. The Velcrin Confederacy was rejected. Their application arrived 3 weeks after the Alliance was announced. It included desperate pleas for help and offers of vast wealth in exchange for human assistance. But it did not include any real acknowledgement of how badly they had treated humanity. The Velcrin talked about unfortunate misunderstandings and regrettable circumstances. They did not admit they had been arrogant and dismissive. They did not acknowledge they had profited from human innovations while mocking human culture. Lucy read the application and wrote a one-word response: denied. The Velcrin sent follow-up messages offering more money, more resources, more territory. Every message was ignored. The Velcrin would have to fix their own problems. The Calthorian Empire refused to even apply. Chancellor Vrex and his government declared they would never submit to human authority. The Calthorians were an ancient and proud civilization. They would solve their own problems without begging for help from a species they still considered primitive. Vrex made several public speeches about Calthorian pride and independence. Behind the scenes, his empire was collapsing. The war with the Draxians was going badly. The economy was in ruins. Colonies were being abandoned. But pride mattered more than survival to Vrex and leaders like him. Earth watched the Calthorians destroy themselves and did nothing to help. The Terran alliance grew quickly. Within 3 months, 40 species had been accepted as members. They ranged from small civilizations of a few billion to medium powers with hundreds of colonies. All of them had one thing in common. They had learned to respect humanity. Alliance space became an island of stability in a chaotic galaxy. Trade flourished within Alliance borders. Research projects brought together human and alien scientists. Military cooperation created powerful defense forces. The member species were grateful but also genuinely happy. They were partners in something better than the old council had ever been. Admiral Nina Foster commanded the Terran Alliance fleet. It was smaller than the old council fleet, but far more effective. Every ship was well maintained. Every crew was well trained. Every officer understood the mission. The Alliance fleet protected member territory and responded to threats with overwhelming force, but it did not patrol non-Alliance space. It did not respond to distress calls from non-members. It did not enforce galactic law in neutral areas. The message was clear: join the Alliance and receive protection or stay outside and face danger alone. A pirate fleet attacked a Minari colony expecting easy prey. The Minari had been weak and pacifist during the Council era. The pirates thought nothing had changed. They were wrong. The Minari were Alliance members now. Their distress call reached Nina's fleet within seconds. Her task force jumped into the system within minutes. The pirates never had a chance. Nina's ships destroyed half the pirate fleet in the first engagement. The rest tried to flee but were hunted down systematically. Nina sent a message to every pirate organization in the galaxy. Alliance territory was protected. Anyone who attacked Alliance members would be destroyed without mercy or hesitation. The pirate attacks on Alliance space stopped completely after that. The contrast between Alliance space and non-Alliance space became more dramatic every month. Alliance members had access to human technology and were advancing rapidly. Non-members were stuck with failing equipment and no way to repair it. Alliance members had strong economies and growing populations. Non-members had declining economies and refugee crises. Alliance members had peace and security. Non-members had war and chaos. Species that had rejected the Alliance or been rejected by the Alliance were suffering terribly. Some of them were learning lessons. Others were too proud to admit their mistakes. The Axiom Collective finally broke. Their telepathic network had degraded to the point where their civilization was non-functional. Millions of Axiom had committed suicide rather than live in isolation. The birth rate had dropped to nearly zero. The Axiom Council knew their species faced extinction within a generation. They sent a message to Earth that was remarkable in its honesty. They had treated humanity terribly during the Council era. They had blocked human psychic research because they feared human mental power. They had considered humans too primitive for telepathy. They had been wrong about everything. They were dying now because of their own arrogance. They were not asking for help. They knew they did not deserve it. They were simply acknowledging their mistakes before their species disappeared. President Hayes read the Axiom message and was moved despite himself. He convened his cabinet to discuss a response. Some advisors argued Earth should